The calls started exactly at 9 o'clock. Every night. Not approximately, not casually, exactly. At first, I thought Sandra was simply struggling after Richard's death the same way I was. Grief makes people cling to routines, voices, certainty. So when my phone rang every evening at precisely 9, I answered warmly. How was your day? Did you eat dinner? Watch anything good tonight? Normal daughter questions. At least that was what I believed initially. The first few weeks even felt comforting. The house became painfully quiet after Richard died. Sometimes entire evenings passed without hearing another human voice. So Sandra's nightly calls softened the silence. That was what made everything afterward hurt so much. Because by the time I realized what the calls really were, I had already started depending on them emotionally. The first strange moment happened on a Thursday in March. I missed the call because I fell asleep watching television. At 9:17, my phone rang again, then again at 9:22. By 9:30, Sandra was knocking on my front door. I opened it wearing pajamas and confusion. Her face looked pale with panic. "Oh my God," I stared at her. "What happened? You didn't answer." The sentence hung strangely between us. Not "Are you okay?" You didn't answer. I laughed softly. "I was asleep." Sandra exhaled shakily and leaned against the doorway. "You scared me." Scared. Interesting word. Not worried briefly. Not curious. Scared. One missed phone call quietly transformed into imagined emergency. I stepped aside to let her inside. The house smelled faintly of chamomile tea and dust from the old radiator. Normal house. Normal night, yet suddenly something about Sandra's panic felt disproportionate. She followed me into the kitchen too quickly, eyes scanning, checking, not consciously perhaps, but checking. Then another strange thing happened. She looked directly at the untouched dinner plate beside the sink. "You didn't eat much." I blinked slowly. "How do you know what I usually eat?" The question froze her instantly. Too late. Something inside me tightened quietly. Sandra smiled too fast. "I just notice things." Notice things. Interesting phrase, not know routines, not care. Notice. Observation language. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 weeks earlier, Sandra casually asking, "You were asleep before 10 yesterday." At the time I thought she called late. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. She already knew I missed the 9 o'clock check-in. Check-in. The phrase appeared suddenly inside my mind, fully formed, not conversations. Check-ins. I stared carefully at my daughter standing beside the refrigerator. "How long have these calls been happening exactly at 9? Sandra hesitated. "Too long." There it was again. Not surprise. Recognition, then softly. "Since January." January, always January. Richard's funeral, the snowstorm, the beginning of everyone quietly becoming afraid. I folded my arms tightly. "You set a schedule. We just wanted consistency." Consistency, interesting word, not connection, not comfort. Consistency, like medication, like monitoring. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. "What happens if I don't answer?" Sandra looked away immediately. Cold spread slowly through my chest. "What happens?" She rubbed her forehead tiredly. "I call Michael." Of course, family coordination again, quiet systems, invisible procedures forming around me without my knowledge. I stared at her carefully. And then, silence, too much silence. Finally, "If neither of us can reach you, someone drives over." The room tilted slightly around me. One missed phone call. And suddenly, family response systems activated. Then another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Michael casually saying, "You've been sleeping earlier lately." At the time, I thought Sandra mentioned our conversations naturally. God help me. They were logging responses. Every call, every answer, every missed ring. I walked slowly toward the living room while cold moved painfully through my chest. Sandra followed behind carefully. Like someone approaching unstable ground, that hurt more than anger would have. Then I noticed something else. Her phone buzzed softly. She glanced down automatically before quickly locking the screen. Too quickly. I saw it anyway. Mom checked in 9:34 p.m. The world seemed to narrow instantly around those words. Checked in. Not spoke with mom, not evening call, checked in, I stared at her phone. What was that? Sandra froze completely, not confusion, terror, real terror. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered the phone into her hands. The notification still glowed faintly across the screen. Mom checked in 9:34 p.m. tiny words. Enormous humiliation. I looked directly at my daughter. What exactly am I checking into? The silence afterward felt endless, because somewhere deep down, both of us suddenly understood the same terrifying thing. The nightly calls were never really conversations at all. They were proof-of-life confirmations. And somehow, without realizing it, I had slowly become the subject of a family monitoring routine disguised as love. Sandra sat at the edge of the couch holding her phone like something dangerous. I stood near the living room lamp staring at the glowing notifications still burned into my mind. Mom checked in 9:34 p.m. checked in. Not talked, not laughed, not connected, checked in. The language itself made me feel less human somehow. Finally, I whispered, "What app is that?" Sandra swallowed hard. "It's just a shared calendar." Shared calendar. Interesting phrase. Not monitoring system, not tracking schedule. Calendar. Soft language wrapping around surveillance again. I held my hand out slowly. "Show me." For several long seconds, she did not move. That hesitation frightened me more than anything else. Because suddenly, I realized the app no longer belonged emotionally to family coordination. It belonged to fear. Sandra finally unlocked the screen and handed me the phone. My stomach tightened instantly. A color-coded calendar filled the display. Blue blocks, green reminders, yellow alerts. And there, repeated across every single evening at 9 o'clock, Mom check the room tilted slightly around me. Not call mom, not evening chat. Check. I stared down at the screen while nausea rolled slowly through my chest. Then I noticed more entries. Monday, Mom check Tuesday, Michael backup Wednesday, SANDRA follow-up if no response follow-up if no response. The words hollowed me completely. One missed phone call quietly transformed into escalation procedures. I looked up slowly. How long has this existed? Sandra wrapped both arms tightly around herself. Since after the snowstorm. Always the snowstorm. One wrong highway exit during dangerous, whether quietly becoming the emotional foundation beneath every monitoring system afterward. I scrolled farther down the calendar. Notes attached beneath certain days. Didn't answer until 9:18. Seemed tired tonight. Voice sounded more confused after nap. Confused after nap. Interesting phrase, not sleepy, not groggy, confused. Symptom language again. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary human fatigue into observational evidence. I sat down slowly because suddenly my legs felt weak. You keep notes about the phone calls. Sandra lowered her eyes immediately. Cold spread painfully through my chest. Every conversation. Every pause, every missed ring. Documented. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. That's why Michael asked if I'd been sleeping more lately. Sandra remained silent. And Claire asking whether I felt lonely at night. More silence. Every ordinary family conversation suddenly rearranged itself differently. Not connection. Assessment. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra casually saying, "You sounded sharper yesterday." Sharp again, always sharp. Not happy, not energetic. Sharp. Every good day quietly framed as temporary reassurance against expected decline. I stared down at the glowing calendar again. Mom check. Tiny phrase. Enormous meaning. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke me. The neurologist said sudden silence can be an early warning sign. Silence. Not rest. Not privacy. Silence. I laughed softly. Brokenly. So now sleeping through a phone call is medically suspicious. The room stayed completely still. Because somewhere deep down, even Sandra heard how horrifying it sounded spoken aloud. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. How many people have access to this? Sandra hesitated too long. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Who? Me, Michael, Claire. Of course. Family coordination again. Quiet systems. Invisible observation networks forming around me without my knowledge. I stared toward the rain-darkened window. And what exactly happens during these checks? Sandra rubbed her forehead tiredly. We just make sure you're okay. No, I suddenly understood something terrifying. The calls were not actually about conversation anymore. They were reassurance rituals. The calendar regulated my children's fear. Every answered call calmed anxiety. Every delayed response triggered escalation. And somewhere along the way, they stopped noticing I was still a person instead of a nightly status confirmation. Then another memory surfaced. Last month, falling asleep in the recliner while reading, waking up to 4 missed calls and Michael's voicemail sounding terrified. At the time, I thought everyone overreacted. Now I understood something worse. I accidentally failed the system. I looked back down at the phone. Mom check complete complete. Not loved, not spoken with complete. I suddenly felt physically ill, then another realization surfaced slowly. For months, I whispered, I thought these calls meant you missed me. Sandra's face crumpled instantly. Because finally she understood the deepest wound underneath everything. Not the calendar, conditional connection. I looked directly at my daughter. If I answer, everyone relaxes. The silence answered before her mouth did. That was the real tragedy, not love disappearing, love becoming procedural. Then Sandra quietly admitted something even worse. Sometimes if you sounded distracted, her voice shook slightly, we'd text each other afterward. I stared at her. What kind of texts? Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Not defensive, not careful, ashamed. Finally she whispered, things like, she sounds better tonight. Better tonight, interesting phrase. Not cheerful, not rested, better. As though every conversation quietly became a cognitive evaluation report afterward. I looked toward the hallway photographs glowing softly in dim light. Richard smiling beside the lake. Christmas mornings, birthday dinners, an entire life. Yet somehow my children had quietly transformed me into something requiring nightly status updates. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard working late for years and forgetting to call sometimes. No one built monitoring calendars. No one created escalation procedures. Because middle-aged silence feels temporary, elderly silence becomes threatening. That was the terrifying difference. I stared down at the glowing words one final time. Mom check. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot reach you. It is realizing how quickly ordinary human absence stops feeling ordinary once fear convinces everyone they might already be slowly losing you. I could not sleep after Sandra left. Every room in the house suddenly felt different somehow. Not unsafe, observed. That was the damage. Once you discover people are quietly monitoring your ordinary routines, even silence starts feeling visible. I sat awake in the living room listening to the old grandfather clock tick softly near the staircase. 11:42, 12:03, 12:27, normal night, yet my mind kept replaying the calendar notification. Mom check complete complete, like I was a task someone marked finished before bed. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. What happened on nights I sounded tired or distracted? Or emotional? How many quiet family conversations followed after hanging up? I suddenly remembered dozens of strange moments differently. Michael calling the morning after I cried unexpectedly during a check-in. Claire texting, "You seem more like yourself today." At the time, I thought they were being emotionally supportive. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, they were comparing observations. Every ordinary interaction suddenly rearranged itself again. Not connection, assessment. Around 1 in the morning, I walked into the kitchen for tea. Then froze. Because suddenly I imagined Sandra seeing lights on through a camera notification or late-night status update somehow. The thought made me physically ill. I stood motionless in the dark kitchen for several seconds before realizing something terrifying. Fear had already entered the house long before I noticed the calendar. That was the real tragedy. Not monitoring, self-conscious existence. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 weeks earlier, Sandra casually asking, still awake around midnight sometimes? At the time I thought she worried about insomnia. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. She was comparing sleep patterns. I gripped the edge of the counter tightly. How many ordinary questions were never ordinary at all? The next morning, Michael arrived unexpectedly carrying groceries. Of course, the family system activating again after emotional disruption. He looked exhausted immediately, like someone already briefed. That frightened me most lately. Everyone always seemed pre-informed now. He set the grocery bags onto the kitchen counter carefully. How are you doing? Doing. Interesting word. Not, how was your night? Doing. Soft clinical language again. I laughed softly. You already received the report from Sandra, didn't you? Michael froze instantly. Too late. The silence answered everything. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Family updates, status conversations, private evaluations, all happening around me while I still believed nightly phone calls were simply love. Then Michael quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. She was worried you'd stop answering altogether. Stop answering altogether, not miss calls occasionally, not sleep deeply. Stop. The future version of me quietly invading the present again. I folded my arms tightly. So one missed call became possible cognitive decline. It wasn't just the call. Always not just. Tiny moments collected emotionally until ordinary humanity starts resembling evidence. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The calendar has emergency plans, doesn't it? Michael lowered his eyes immediately. There it was, confirmation. What plans? Silence. Too much silence. Finally, if no one reaches you by morning, we contact neighbors. Neighbors. The word landed heavily inside my chest. Mrs. Ellis again. Church friends. People waving too carefully lately. I stared at my son. So other people know about this. We just wanted safety backups. Backups. Interesting word. Not support network. Not community. Backups. Like disaster planning. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Mrs. Ellis saying, "Glad to see your lights on this morning." At the time, I smiled politely because I thought nothing of it. God help me. Maybe someone called her after a missed check-in. I suddenly felt exposed in a way I could barely describe. Not because people cared, because people monitored. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke me. The first night you didn't answer after Dad died. His voice cracked slightly. I thought maybe we'd lost you too. There it was finally. The real terror underneath everything. Not phone calls. Trauma. Fear of one parent dying quietly transforming into hypervigilance around the surviving one. That was what made forgiveness possible eventually. Not easy, but possible. I looked toward Richard's empty chair near the living room window. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The calls were never really about talking to me. Michael looked up immediately. What? They were about calming yourselves. The room stayed completely still. Because finally the truth sat clearly between us. The calendar regulated fear. Every answered phone call reassured my children they had not lost another parent overnight. And somewhere inside that process, I slowly stopped being experienced as an independent person and became a nightly anxiety checkpoint instead. Then another memory surfaced. Richard traveling for work and forgetting to call for entire evenings sometimes. No family panic systems, no escalation procedures, because middle-aged absence feels temporary. Elderly silence becomes threatening. That was the cruel difference. I stared directly at Michael. For months, I thought you all missed hearing my voice. The tears filled his eyes instantly. Because finally, he understood the deepest wound underneath everything. Conditional connection. I sat slowly at the kitchen table while morning rain tapped softly against the windows again. Always rain lately, then quietly admitted something for the first time. I started staying awake to avoid missing the calls. Michael's face crumpled completely, because there it was again. The real damage. Self-adjustment. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to reorganize their own lives around other people's anxiety. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot reach you. It is realizing how quickly ordinary independence begins feeling irresponsible, once fear convinces everyone they are already slowly preparing to lose you. That evening, I deliberately did not answer the phone at 9 o'clock, not to punish anyone, to understand the system. The realization alone frightened me. Because suddenly my own life felt structured enough to test. At 9:00 exactly the phone rang. Sandra, I watched the screen glow silently across the coffee table. At 9:04 another call. At 9:09 Michael. At 9:13 Sandra again. The house stayed completely still around me while the phone vibrated softly against the wood. Normal living room, normal evening. Yet somehow the silence itself suddenly felt criminal. That was the damage. Once people begin treating ordinary absence like possible danger, privacy starts feeling selfish somehow. At 9:17 a text arrived. Please answer, just want to know you're okay. Know you're okay, interesting phrase, not miss you, not worried emotionally. No, certainty again. I sat motionless beside Richard's old recliner listening to rain tap softly against the windows. At 9:24 another message. Mom, please. At 9:31 headlights swept briefly across the living room wall outside. Michael, of course, escalation procedures. I suddenly felt physically sick. One unanswered phone call quietly transforming into physical welfare checks. Then, another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. How many times had this happened before when I simply thought people were dropping by? The front door rattled softly, then knocking. Urgent, controlled, terrified. Mom, I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I wanted revenge, because suddenly I finally understood how completely fear had consumed my children. The knocking grew louder. Mom, please answer. Then another voice. Sandra. She might have fallen, not sleeping, not bathing, not reading quietly, fallen. Every silence automatically interpreted as catastrophe now. I stood slowly and walked toward the door. The moment I opened it, both of them visibly exhaled. Real relief, real panic. That was what made everything so tragic. No villains, no cruelty. Just terrified people slowly losing proportion after grief. Michael stepped forward immediately. Why didn't you answer? I looked directly at him. Because I was reading. The silence afterward felt enormous, because suddenly everyone heard how ordinary that sounded. Then Sandra whispered softly, we thought something happened. There it was again. Fear instantly expanding uncertainty into disaster. I stepped aside quietly and let them inside. Both entered too quickly, eyes scanning automatically. Checking, not consciously perhaps, but checking. That hurt more than anger would have. Then another realization surfaced. My home no longer emotionally felt like private space inside my children's minds. It had become a monitored environment requiring status confirmation. I sat slowly in the living room chair. Sandra remained standing near the hallway, still tense, still evaluating. Then Michael quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. The calendar sends alerts after 20 minutes. Alerts, interesting word, not reminders, not concern. Alerts, like security systems, like emergencies. I stared at him carefully. So my silence triggers alarms. No, yes, my voice cracked sharply now. You built an alert system around me. The room stayed completely still. Because spoken aloud, fear finally sounded visible again. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Claire casually saying, you answered faster tonight. At the time I thought nothing of it. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, response times mattered. Everything mattered. Every answered call, every delayed response, every missed ring. Data. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. You all discuss how quickly I answer, don't you? Sandra covered her mouth instantly. Too late. The silence answered everything. Cold spread slowly through my chest. Not conversations, metrics. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke me. The neurologist said sudden withdrawal can happen early sometimes. Withdrawal, not wanting quiet, not reading peacefully. Withdrawal. symptom language quietly consuming ordinary solitude again. I looked around my own living room slowly. Richard's chair, family photographs, the old clock ticking softly beside the staircase. My home. Yet somehow every room now existed inside invisible surveillance procedures. Then another realization surfaced painfully. For months, I whispered, I stopped taking baths at night. Sandra looked up immediately. What? I was afraid I'd miss the calls. The tears filled her eyes instantly. Because finally she understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not concern, behavioral shrinking. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to reorganize ordinary life around avoiding other people's panic. Then another memory surfaced. Richard falling asleep during movies constantly and missing calls for years. Everyone laughed about it affectionately. No emergency alerts, no escalation systems. Because middle-aged silence feels harmless, elderly silence becomes suspicious. That was the cruel difference. I looked directly at my children standing in the living room. Then quietly asked, "Do you know what the calls became for me?" Neither answered. Attendance. The word settled heavily through the room, because there it was. The deepest wound underneath everything. The quiet transformation of ordinary connection into required proof of continued functioning. Then Sandra whispered softly, "I think after Dad died, every unanswered call started feeling unbearable. Perfect honesty at last, not control, trauma." Fear had quietly transformed my children into people emotionally bracing for loss every single night. That did not erase the damage, but finally, at least, it explained it. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot reach you. It is realizing how quickly ordinary privacy starts being treated like a possible emergency. Once fear convinces everyone you might already be slowly disappearing. The next morning, I turned my phone off completely. Not dramatically, quietly. I placed it inside the kitchen drawer beside the old recipe cards and closed the drawer gently. No buzzing, no alerts. No check-ins, just silence, real silence. And for the first time in months, the house briefly felt like mine again. That realization nearly made me cry. I spent the morning slowly. Coffee near the window, laundry folding, Richard's old jazz records playing softly in the background, ordinary life. Yet underneath everything sat a strange nervousness. Because even without the phone ringing, part of me kept anticipating the system. That was the damage. Fear repeated long enough eventually teaches older adults to emotionally brace for observation even when no one is actively watching. Around noon, there was knocking at the front door. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly before opening it. Sandra, Michael, Claire, all three, the full escalation procedure. Sandra's face looked pale with exhaustion. "We've been calling for hours." Hours. Interesting word, not this morning. Not a little while, hours, like absence itself had become alarming. I stepped aside slowly to let them in. The moment they entered, I saw it again. Scanning. Eyes moving quickly across the room. Checking details automatically. Coffee cup. Curtains open, television off. Observation had become instinct now. That was the tragedy. Then Claire whispered softly, "You scared us." Scared, always scared. Never intrusive, never overwhelming, scared. I folded my arms tightly. I turned my phone off. The room went completely still. Because suddenly everyone heard how ordinary that sounded. Then Michael quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. "We almost called the police." Police. The word landed heavily inside my chest. What? We thought maybe something happened overnight. Overnight, not enjoying peace, not sleeping deeply, something happened. Fear had quietly transformed simple inaccessibility into possible catastrophe. I stared toward the kitchen drawer, holding my silent phone. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. If I disappear from the system, panic starts immediately. No one answered, because everyone knew it was true. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, Sandra asking casually, "Would you ever consider a medical alert bracelet?" At the time, I thought she worried after the snowstorm. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No. They were already planning future monitoring layers. Every ordinary suggestion suddenly rearranged itself differently. Not support. Containment. Then Claire whispered something that nearly broke me. The calendar showed you missed 3 check-ins in a row. 3 check-ins. Interesting phrase, not missed conversations, not missed calls. Check-ins, like hospital procedures. Like institutional care. I sat slowly at the dining room table while sunlight moved softly across the wood, then quietly asked, "Do you know what I realized last night?" No one answered. I stopped feeling allowed to be unavailable. The room stayed completely still, because there it was again, the deepest wound underneath everything, not the calls themselves, conditional autonomy. For months, ordinary privacy slowly became emotionally interpreted as risk. Then another realization surfaced painfully. I started sleeping lightly. Sandra looked up immediately. What? So I wouldn't miss the calls? The tears filled her eyes instantly, because finally she understood the actual damage underneath everything, not monitoring, self-abandonment. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to reorganize even rest around preventing other people's panic. Then another memory surfaced. Richard spending entire weekends fishing with terrible phone reception for years. No family emergencies. No escalation plans, because middle-aged silence feels independent. Elderly silence becomes threatening. That was the cruel difference. I looked directly at my children standing silently around the dining room. Do you know what the calls stopped feeling like? Sandra shook her head weakly. Love. The word settled heavily through the quiet house, because there it was, perfect truth. Not because love disappeared, because fear changed its shape. The calls became obligation. Proof, attendance, not connection. Then Michael whispered softly, "We just needed to know you were okay." No again. Always no. Certainty quietly replacing trust. I stared toward Richard's empty chair near the window. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The calendar was never really about communication. It regulated grief. Every answered phone call reassured my children they had not lost another parent that day. That was why missing one call felt catastrophic. Not because I seemed confused. Not because I burned toast. Because trauma had quietly taught them absence could become permanent without warning. And somewhere inside that fear, I slowly stopped being treated like a fully independent person and became something requiring nightly confirmation. Then Claire quietly cried. Not loud crying. Ashamed crying. Because finally she understood too, not intellectually, emotionally. The system had not simply monitored me. It had slowly transformed ordinary family love into procedural reassurance. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen drawer, then placed my silent phone carefully on the table between us. Tiny object, enormous power. For months, I whispered, this stopped being a phone. The room stayed completely still. It became proof I was still here. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say after that. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot reach you. It is realizing how quickly ordinary independence starts being treated like dangerous unpredictability. Once fear convinces everyone they might already be preparing to lose you. That night, nobody called at 9 o'clock. The silence felt almost unnatural at first. I kept glancing toward the phone automatically while the old clock ticked softly beside the staircase. 8:57. 8:59. 9:00. Nothing, no vibration, no ringing. No proof of life check disguised as conversation, just quiet, real quiet. And for several long seconds, I did not know whether to feel relieved or abandoned. That realization frightened me, because somewhere along the way, the system had conditioned all of us. My children needed the calls to calm their fear, and I had slowly started needing them too. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Fear reshapes everyone involved eventually. I sat alone in the living room with Richard's old sweater folded beside me on the couch. Rain moved softly against the windows again. Always rain lately. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For months now, every single evening ended with evaluation. Did mom sound tired? Did she repeat herself? Did she answer quickly enough? No wonder the silence suddenly felt unfamiliar. Ordinary family connection had quietly transformed into routine assessment, so gradually none of us fully noticed it happening. At 9:11, the phone lit up once. A message from Sandra, no call. No urgency, just love you, sleep well. I stared at the words for a very long time. Not check-in complete, not why didn't you answer, just love you. The simplicity nearly broke me. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard calling from business trips years ago just to say, "Still alive, don't burn the house down without me." Everyone laughed. No panic systems. No monitoring calendars. Because middle-aged absence feels temporary. Elderly absence becomes emotionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. I walked slowly into the kitchen and made tea. No fear about missing calls. No nervousness about response times. Just tea. Such an ordinary thing. Yet suddenly it felt enormous. That was the real damage fear creates. Not rules. Loss of ordinary freedom. Then another realization surfaced painfully. For months now, every evening routine had unconsciously revolved around preventing my children's anxiety. Baths shortened, movies paused, phone kept nearby constantly. Tiny adjustments repeated long enough until my own life quietly reorganized itself around other people's fear. I carried the tea back into the living room and sat beside the window. Outside, streetlights reflected softly across wet pavement while distant cars moved through rain. Normal night, normal world, and suddenly I understood something important for the first time. My children were not cruel, they were traumatized. Richard's death had shattered something fundamental inside them. One day he existed, the next day he didn't. After that, silence itself stopped feeling safe. That did not erase the damage, but finally it explained the shape of it. Then another memory surfaced. Sandra standing at the hospital after Richard died whispering, "I can't lose another parent." At the time I hugged her and promised she wouldn't. God help me. Maybe everything afterward started there. Not with the snowstorm, not with burned toast, with grief. Grief quietly transforming ordinary fear into systems of control disguised as protection. The phone buzzed again softly around 10:30. Another message from Sandra. No pressure, no urgency, just, "Thank you for talking to us today." I closed my eyes briefly. Because suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. My daughter had been afraid too, not just of losing me eventually, of upsetting me, of going too far. Of becoming someone who monitored instead of loved. Fear had trapped all of us differently. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The calls themselves were never really the problem. The problem was that they stopped being freely chosen. The moment love becomes attendance. The moment silence becomes suspicious. The moment answering the phone starts feeling mandatory, something essential quietly disappears from the relationship. Autonomy, trust, the dignity of being allowed ordinary absence without catastrophe attached to it. I looked toward Richard's photograph glowing softly beside the bookshelf. No labels, no hidden notes. No calendar alerts, just memory. Then I whispered softly into the quiet house, "I'm still here." Not for the system, not for confirmation, for myself. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot reach you. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary human independence into something emotionally treated like risk. One missed phone call. One unanswered evening. One difficult season after grief. Tiny moments repeated emotionally until the people who love you stop simply calling because they miss your voice and start needing proof you still exist on the other end of the line.